In this video, we're going to look at render layers and how to get out the layers we need from Maya to bring into After Effects to put a animated character over a backplane. So in After Effects, and we're going to start with the end result so we can see what we're going for. We start from the ground up, and so we start with the backplate. In Maya, we've got this set up as the image plane for the shot camera, and we match our camera in Maya to the camera that took this footage, or in this case, a still photo backplate, and that is our backplate coming in at the bottom. I'm going to zoom in a little and hold the space bar so I can see where my character's coming in. On top of the backplate, that is our ambient occlusion shadow, and we can see the two dark footprints, and there's just a little bit of darkness around it. And then on top of that, we've got our bright sunlight shadow. On top of that goes our character, and this is just the ambient light on the character. No self-shadowing, just the character with the ambient light coming from the HDR. And then we have the ambient shadow on the character as a separate pass. And so that's the self-shadowing of the character with the ambient light. On top of that goes the sun, and the sun includes self-shadowing. And then on top of that is the ambient occlusion to help give detail into the character. Now I already have these all set to their blending modes. Shadows, in general, we set to blending mode multiply. Shadows go to multiply. That first color of the character, the ambient light, is set to blending mode normal. The shadow on top of it is multiply, but then that sunlight, blending mode add. So the first light from the ambient light is normal, and then all the other lights that we add in are additive. And when we divide up our render layers, I like to divide them up or think them through by light. So when I'm setting up my render layers, I'll have my ambient light, which is my HDR, for the color pass of the character, the self-shadowing of the character, and the shadow on the ground. Then my sunlight will have the sun of the character and that self-shadowing sun on the ground. They come into the comp in different levels, but I set them up in layers thinking that way, and then the ambient occlusion for the ground and the character. Okay. So those are the passes we need to get our character to look good. And when I zoom back out, you can see that's a pretty nice match. Here in my Maya scene, I have my character animated, and let's come back to my channel box, and Martha Ruff and eyes both need the P on. P is for playback. If P is not on, they will be invisible during playback. So there, turned off P. Oh my God, it's just a skeleton every time I hit play. Put that P back on for playback, and it will show up as I scrub through so I can actually animate. I have my shot camera set up, and this image plane is attached to the shot camera, looking over Martha. And of course, I have my sky dome, and attached to the sky dome in the color channel, attribute editor, sky dome in the color channel is the HDR taken as the class project. So that's what we need to get ready for our render layers. We need our character animated, and the animation happens in front of the shot camera, so we know that it's all going to be how we want it. And it looks like that shot camera is not actually how I want it. So I'll make a quick adjustment. Scene one, shot one. Adjust its rotation just a teeny bit so Martha's actually off the grass and in that darker spot. And then to make sure I don't keep moving the camera, lock its channels. I do that usually before I even start to animate, so I know that my camera is set and ready to go. Okay, so camera set, animated. I've got my sunlight all set, my directional light acting as the sun, and you can see it's pointing up to where the sun was coming over that building, and that's that little pile of light that is sunlight that's right there, right on the edge of those shadows. So I'll actually rename my directional light sun, because that's what it's serving as. Okay, so now I want to set up render layers for each light in the scene. So I come up to my render layers, plus sign to get a new layer, and I start with character, ambient light, and I click on the eyeball, and you can see everything in my shot cameras disappeared. So here's my main scene layer. I click on the eyeball for that. That's where everything is. This render layer is the master scene. Come back to this layer. It should be updating. It's not up. Okay. When I click on the panel, it becomes active and updates. Nothing's in there yet. So let's find Martha, and her geometry is what I want. I'll come back to the master layer just long enough to find her eyeballs, which are a little challenging to grab. And you can see it didn't grab her eyes. It grabbed the head. Open up their groups. So now I can grab actual. There's the geo under the constrained group. So iGeo and Martha. That's the geometry I want. And in this layer, I'm going to create a collection. So I right click on layer, create collection. I'll name that char for character. Could name it Martha. Add over here, and that adds my geometry to this collection because it's the collection of things that are in the layer. And what I want from this layer is just her interacting with the just the sky dome light. So I'm going to grab first the sky dome light, create collection, sky dome or HDR or ambient light, whatever I want to call it, add. Now for this first layer for her, I don't want her self-shadowing. Come over to the attribute editor for the sky dome light, and I'm going to middle mouse button drag cast shadows to this layer, click on this absolute override that was just created, and turn off cast shadows. So now come over to this panel to make sure I'm in the right spot, make sure that this is the layer that's going to be rendering, do a quick test render, and I can see that I need to prep my scene better for the render layout, render setup. So prepping my scene, let's make sure that we've got the right setup. My backplate is 6,000 by 4,000, so we're going to start with the resolution. Device aspect ratio 1.5, rather let's turn off maintain width height ratio. Set it back to the max resolution of our backplate, 6,000 by 4,000. And then I adjust the maintain width height ratio. I only want to render at 1,000 pixels, but have that same aspect ratio. That's going to work well for me. And for the camera, this should have been done when I did the camera match, but always make sure. Attribute editor. My film aspect ratio should be 1.5. And I'll live with those small discrepancies. And then I actually want to get rid of my backplate. I don't want my backplate, my image plane, in my renders. Go back to my master layer so I can see everything. There we go. There's my image plane. And I can select that. And I'm going to delete it out of the scene. I don't want it to show up anymore in my renders. It was useful animating. It was useful, crucial for setting up the camera, but now I don't want it to render. And I will set my sky dome to make sure it's not visible in camera. Okay. So now when I render this layer, I am successfully getting character with no self shadow from the HDR, but the sunlight is still on. It brings in the lights by default to the layers. So I'm going to select my sun, render layers, and I'm going to right click on the layer, create a collection, call it sun, add the sunlight in, and then I will middle mouse button drag the intensity into there, absolute override, set the intensity to 0, which essentially just turns the sun off. It'll have no light, no shadow, all good. Check my render layers. I want to have this layer rendering, and when I render it, you can see it's darker and without self shadows. So layer 1 accomplished. Close it up. Let's make the second layer, and we'll name this char. I'll abbreviate ambient self shad. So it's the ambient light, character, self shadow. So once again, I'm going to want Martha and her eyes. Geo and Geo for the eyes, rough, and I'll create my collection and I'll call it char, add, okay. And there she is. I just want her self shadow. Let's see, she needs to have a shader override for the matte shadow. Create shader override. And I'll go find the Arnold shadow matte. There we are. Okay. So now she's just going to return the shadow. And I want the ambient light in there. The sky dome with the HDR, create collection, ambient light. Okay, that's in. I don't actually want any changes on the ambient light this time. I want it to cast shadows. So let's make sure I'm in this layer. Cast shadows is on. If I come back to this layer, it's off. Good, that's working. And I want the sun off again. Then I'm going to grab my sun, create collection, name it sun. And again, I drag the intensity to get my layer override, and I set it to 0. And now when I render this scene, or this layer, it comes up all black because the only thing I should be getting is shadows. And when I come up here and click on this, what looks to me like a radioactive symbol, I get the shadow. I can see it in the alpha channel. There we go. So that one's good. And then I want the ambient shadow. So new layer, ambient Martha or char shad. And again, I start with Martha. Right click, create collection. And there she is. And this time, I want her to be invisible. I want to see her shadow, but I don't want to see her. So come over to the attribute editor. There we go in the shape. Render stats. And I'm going to drag primary visibility over. And there's my override, and it'll affect all the geometry. And just turn it off. Make sure I'm in this active layer. And as soon as I hit that active layer, I get the red warning, hey, there's an override here. Nice, that's what I want. And when I click on the geometry individually, I've got it on my geo rough, geo. I don't seem to have it on that piece of geo, on that eye, but I do have it on this eye. So Not sure why I missed this eye. Oh, there, because this one is actually a group. We'll remove it. And that's the left eye, so I'm missing my right eye geometry. There, the one that says geometry, add. And now, it's not getting it. I'm going to be better off being sure. I'm going to delete that collection and start it again. Make sure I get the geometry. There's my eyes, not the groups. Create collection, add them in. Okay, yes, this time it says geometry. And so I'll drag my primary viz in. Oops, let's shrink this down a little. There we go. And from here, turn off the primary visibility. I'm in the proper layer. And I want to check rough, eyeball, eyeball. They've all got that override. Excellent. So now they're going to be invisible, but you can see that they still cast shadows. So we want the ground plane to get that shadow. So I come back to scenes, eyeball for that main layer, and it's not updating. Oh, no, it might be updating. My plane is hidden. Shift H. There we go. It was just invisible. It did update. And I'm going to come back to my layer 2, make it active. New collection, ground plane, add it in. There it is. And this plane already has the shadow matte shader. So it's just going to return the shadow. Render it. Can't see anything because it's a shadow on a black background. So click on the alpha. Oop, that hard white is the shadow for the sun. So I've got the ambient shadow, but I need the sun shadow removed. Come back to my render layer. Sun is selected. Create collection. Sun. Drag the intensity. Turn it off. And we'll render test again. And there's just my ambient without that sun shadow. Okay, now's a good time to save my work. So that is the ambient layers. I have my character, the character's self-shadow with the ambient light, and the ground shadow from the ambient. So now I want to deal with the sunlight. But I start with the character. So I geometry, and rough. New layer, char sun, and I'm going to let the sun layer self-shadow. Create my collection, char, there it is, in the layer, and we'll make this the active layer, so there's just the character. Yep, and let's see, I want my sky dome light to be off. So I'll grab my sky dome light, right click on the layer, create collection. So grab my sky dome, add it in, and I'm going to middle mouse drag intensity, set that to 0, so that will be off. Then I'll grab the sun, make a collection for that, add it in, so the sun is now in that layer, and I want that sun to be normal. Render. There's the alpha channel, and I'll come up here to click on RGB, and there's the sunlight on Martha, and you can see some of these shadowy areas where it's just not self-lighting. There's the shadows self-shadowing. We want that. Okay, so that's Martha and the sun, and then I want the ground shadow for the sun as another layer. So I'll make a new layer, sun char shad, tells me everything I need to know. It's the sunlight, the character, shadow. And I'm going to grab Martha, create the collection, add her in, and this time I want her to be invisible. So I grab the primary visibility, drag it over, turn it off. So she's going to be invisible in this layer, but she will cast shadows. And I'm going to grab the sunlight and just add it in. So now I've got the sun coming into the scene, AI sky dome. Let's make sure I'm on the right one. There we go. Ooh, I have no Martha. Ooh, that's the smooth. And her layer, smooth layer's off. I didn't grab the right one. If I remove it and put in the rough, does that work? We'll find out. Click on that to update. Primary visibility is off. And yes, okay, that did update her rough primary visibility off for this layer. Cool. So I've got the sun. Just to be sure, I'm going to turn off the ambient light in this layer. Intensity override. Set the intensity to 0, just turning this ambient light off. And then I need the ground plane, which has the shadow matte on it. So I come back to this main scene so I can see it. Select the object, come back to the layer I'm working with, create collection, ground plane, and I don't need an override because it already has that shadow matte on it. Add it in, and when I test render this layer, I should be getting black on black, so that's normal. And when I hit my alpha channel, there's the hard black shadow of the sunlight on the ground. Perfect. Render layers, sun char shad, char sun. Okay, I do want my ambient occlusion for this because it adds a lot, and I want the ambient occlusion on the character, and I want the ambient occlusion on the ground from the character. So I'll start with the character. What a shock, I know. New layer, Ayo, and I will grab the rough and the eyes, create new collection, add, and I'll put us into this layer. And I'm going to right click on that and create a shader override to get the ambient occlusion. Double click on the shader, Arnold, there's my AI ambient occlusion, boom. Now I do want the ambient occlusion from the ground. It helps to darken the light that would otherwise be coming up from the ambient light ground, and then we want that blocked. So I'm going to grab the ground plane, come back to this layer, make it active, create a collection for it, ground plane, and add it in. And for the ground plane, I don't want to see it. I just want its occlusion. So I will middle mouse drag the primary viz and turn it off. There we go. So now when I render, there's my alpha. RGB, there's just the ambient occlusion. So ambient occlusion ground layer, AO ground, and I'll grab my Martha rough, eyeball, eyeball, create the collection, add, and I want her to occlude, but to be invisible. So primary visibility, select that override, turn it off, make sure I'm in the right layer. Now the rough and the eye geometry all have that visibility override, cool. And then I want the ground plane to be catching that, so select it, new collection, ground plane, okay. Add the ground plane. Oops, I didn't add it in yet. Add, there we go. And the ground plane, I want to have the shader override for ambient occlusion. There we go. So I have my character whose primary visibility is off. I have the ground plane that's giving me the override. So let's render. And am I not in the right layer? Yes, AO ground was not the active layer rendering. So we'll do that again. Bah, I couldn't see it because it was still set to alpha. There we go. Set it to color, and there's my character ambient occlusion shadow. Cool. And let's see, if I were to add a alpha channel layer, which sometimes is really useful, I select her rough and her geo, new layer, alpha, maybe it would be char alpha or Martha alpha, create the collection. And I only want her in this scene. There she is, shader override. And this time I want a Maya surface shader. I want the surface shader. And in this, I set the out color to white. And when I render it, I will get a black and white image that is essentially an alpha channel if I need it. And it should help with the grass over her feet when we start compositing that. Okay, those are the render layers set up. But we want to render with GPU rendering because it's so much faster. Problem is, GPU rendering does not work with the matte shadow shader or the shadow matte shader. So all of these shadow layers, I'm going to come to ambient self shadow, and I've set it to GPU globally. But I'll right click, absolute layer override, CPU, and I'm going to do that for each one of my shadow layers. And you can see when I click on the eyeball, it updates. Absolute override, CPU, sun shadow, absolute, update it. There we go. Right click, override, CPU, ambient occlusion are fine. Character alpha is fine because that's really just a black and white image we created. So it's just those three shadow layers need the CPU. And then let's come back to common. I am going to be rendering in the 1.5 format, render 1000 by 667. That should be our final film format for this case. Let's set up the names. I'm going to right click, render layer, underscore camera. So scene one, shot one. Actually, I'm going to do camera first, underscore, then render layer. Scene one, shot one, render layer. Image format, EXR, compression to none. Name dot number dot extension. That's always what we want. Leave the frame padding at 4. Frame padding means that will be frame 0001, 4 significant digits in the numbering. And I would render however many frames I want, which would be 19. And then the shot camera, perspective, scene 1, shot 1. And I'll name this version 3 because I think this is the third time I've set this up testing it. And then I would hit rendering, menu set, render, tell it render sequence, and it's going to go ahead and render each one of those layers frame by frame. And that gives me the output that I started with to create my After Effects setup. Okay, so have fun rendering.